Hello, this is Kenny at the General Paintball Museum, and today we are going to show you how to take apart and service a Tippmann 98 Custom. First thing we'll need to do is remove the barrel and the feed neck. The feed neck you press down on the front sight on the top and it'll swivel down. Next we'll be removing the 6 body bolts using the factory 1/8 inch Allen key. And then there are 6, one over the front grip, which is a longer bolt than the rest, and then the others are all the same length and they're interchangeable. If one of the body bolts becomes stripped, you can use a drill or drill press and drill off the head of the bolt, and then using a punch or a straight object, you can punch out the bolt with the nut on the back side out, and then you'll be able to save the nut and replace the body bolt with a new one. Some of the aftermarket body bolts that were made for the Tippmann 98s are not all 1/8 inch Allen key, so you'll have to pick out the appropriate Allen key for the appropriate screw you have. For the body bolt that is located in the grip panel, you can remove the grip panel on the back side to access the nut if you need to drill out that body bolt and knock it out for replacement. With all the body bolts removed, you can now remove the front grip and then loosen the 2 ASA screws on the bottom using an 1/8 inch Allen key, and then carefully remove the clamshells. You want to keep a special eye on the front sight because there is a spring and it can fly off. We can now remove the internals from the marker. I start with the rear cap, then the rear sight, and then the rear spring and spring guide, and then the buffer O-ring, and then the linkage arm, and the cocking knob, and the rear bolt, and the inner rear bolt, followed by the front bolt off the power tube, the ball latch, this one is bad, then the sear and sear spring. You want to make sure that the sear is not worn and it is a crisp corner. Sear spring has both hooks on it still. And then the pins. One is a black pin, which is a hardened steel and is for the sear to ride on. The rest are all silver and interchangeable. The trigger and the trigger spring inside of it, the safety button, the trigger guard, and the trigger spring, the front sight spring, and then the front sight and pin. The pin is removable from the front sight and it is a little bit shorter of a pin. Then you can remove the ASA with the bolts, and then the 2 1/8 inch Allen keys for the valve. These screws are short and are typically Loctited in position, so they are tight. It is not necessary to remove the valve and power tube, but for this one, since the body is so dirty, we'll need to remove it to be easier to clean. Some 98 Customs have a response trigger or a plug in the side port there, that black plastic nub is, and you need to remove the fitting off that to remove the power tube. To begin cleaning the body, I use a little oil. This breaks up some of the loose paint and grease that is built up inside the body, and then I wipe it off with a paper towel. The end result, we would like a smooth, clean surface for the internal parts to slide on. The Tippmann 98 has a high tolerance for dirt and buildup, but it will work best if you can get it as clean as possible. This marker has an excessive amount of old paint and goo built up in it from many years of use. With being unable to clean all the gunk out of the marker, we'll have to polish the internals. This process involves using some sandpaper, preferably 80 to 100 grit. You sand it on the areas that the bolts and moving parts will be gliding against. You don't want to remove a ton of material, but you do want it to be smooth to the touch as you slide your hand across it. You can get excessive, and you could start with an 80 grit sandpaper and go to 100 and then go to like a 120 or 150 and get a mirror-like finish in there, but it is not entirely necessary. Make sure when you get done sanding that you wipe it all down again and that you oil it before the marker is reassembled. You want to get all the old metal shavings or dirt out of the marker so it doesn't gum it back up. Next, we'll start working on the internals themselves. The rear bolt, we'll do the same. We'll rub some oil on that, and then we will remove the oil and hopefully some of the gunk with it to break it up with a rag. And then we'll check the O-ring also on the rear bolt. This one is kind of yellowed. It doesn't feel bad, but it is kind of older. I use a test of turning it into a figure 8 and tugging. If it breaks, it's definitely bad. For safety's sake, we're going to replace this one with a new O-ring. With the gunk buildup on this one, we're going to go ahead and remove that new O-ring, give it a light sanding, and then we will make sure it's smooth to the touch, and then give it a coat of oil and rub it in really well, and then reinstall the new O-ring. With the rear bolt cleaned up, we set it aside, and then we start looking at the inner rear bolt. There's not much that goes on with this, so you can go ahead and rub it in with oil, clean it off, and just make sure it's clean. And then we also give that another coat of oil because it does have a little bit of room for wiggle on the inside. Some later models have a plastic insert, and all you would need to do is clean it. Moving on to the front bolt, it's just a plastic bolt with an O-ring on the front. And I want to clean all the old paint and gunk off of it, and then you want to check the front O-ring to make sure it is in good condition. We'll just go ahead and change that to be safe. It is still probably a good O-ring, and but then you get the gunk behind the O-ring. Go ahead and remove it. If you want to get really carried away, you can remove there's two little plastic nubs on the very front from the casting, and you can lightly hit it with some sandpaper and remove those nubs. Next part up is the linkage arm. This one has some build up of gunk, so we'll hit it lightly with the sandpaper and then wipe it clean, and then we'll give it a coat of oil because it does ride in that top channel on the body. Then we have the safety button. There's a little orange O-ring. We want to make sure there's no chunks taken out of it or it's not dry rotted or broken. This one is in really good shape, so we'll leave it on there. Next is the trigger guard. We want to lightly hit it with some oil that I had on my finger, and then it helps clean it up really well. It's kind of like an armor all for the plastic part. Then we have the cocking knob. This goes in the rear bolt. We just want to wipe it clean, use a little oil to break up any gunk on the cocking knob, and then use a rag to wipe it clean again. Next up is the trigger, the plastic trigger itself, and then we have a metal clip that goes around the back, held in place by a pin, and then there's a spring underneath of it. We're going to make sure everything is in place and not bent or broken, and then we're going to look at that metal clip to make sure it is not damaged or bent or worn down excessively. Then we have the buffer O-ring. It just glides around the spring on the rear. I just want to make sure that's clean and it's not dry rotted, so when you do the figure 8 test, it doesn't break. Followed by the rear cap that is plastic. You can use oil to break up some of the gunk and paint, and then wipe it clean. And then this also kind of acts like an armor all. Keeps the plastic looking healthy. Next up is the sear, and the sear, we want to make sure that it's not rounded off on the top corner. That will give you problems. This is a pull type. There is a spring with 2 loops on it that pulls on the sear. Later models have a spring that pushes up on it. Next we have the front sight clip. This is what allows you to press down and swivel the feed neck down and out of the way, and then remove it if you'd like. I'm just putting a little oil to break up the gunk and paint on it, and then wiping it clean, and then setting it aside. Now we have the front sight clip spring. I'm just going to wipe that down lightly and set it aside for later use. And then the front pin, which is slightly shorter than the rest of the pins. Then we have the rear drive spring. I usually just wipe the springs off. In this case though, I believe we're going to replace all the springs that we can in this marker because it is an older marker. So we will set the old spring aside. Next we have the spring guide. We'll oil that and see if we can get some of the gunk off of that. But again, it has quite a bit build up on it. So we'll hit it with some sandpaper to get it good, smooth, and clean. And then I like to add a little oil to it because the spring does slide on top of it. Next up is the sear spring. This was a pull type one, but again, we're going to replace it with our new springs. Then we have our body pins here that hold the sear and trigger in place. You want to make sure those are straight and not bent. If they are bent, you'll need to replace them as soon as possible. Then we have the trigger spring itself, which allows the spring to return upright. But again, we're going to replace that with our new spring kit also. Last but not least is the power tube and valve. We're just going to basically clean this up, make sure there's no gunk build up around any part of it. We also want to make sure there's no cracks in the power tube, towards the back especially, because that is a sealing point for the valve. Reassembling, We start with the power tube and valve. I like to put a little bit of oil on the power tube just to keep it lubricated and not sticking to anything. If any old paint gets in there, we don't want it to be stuck to the body for later. With two bolts that hold the valve and power tube in place, they do recommend you use red Loctite. A drop on each one will do, and then the short screws will just go in there and hold it in place. You don't want these to work themselves out. If they work themselves out on their own, they will strip the valve and you'll be required to replace the valve body. Next, we'll start by reinstalling the rear bolt, inserting the inner rear bolt into the rear bolt, making sure the two holes for the cocking knob line up, and then the cocking knob hole lines up with the rear hole that the spring will later go into. Next, we clean up the rear side a little bit, and then we install it right back in the top corner. Older versions used a thumb screw, so you could slide it side to side. Next, we're going to install the rear main spring. We're going to use the new spring from the Madman spring kit. It comes with 3 different springs for the main spring, a hard, a medium, and a low. We went with the hard spring. Then installing the spring guide, the buffer O-ring over the spring and spring guide, and then the rear cap. I like to keep that seam going up and down, the same as the clamshell. Then the front bolt, and slide that on the power tube, and then add a little lubrication to the linkage arm, and then link the front bolt to the rear bolt, adding a little lubrication behind it on the body. Next, we will start to insert the pins that hold the sear. Again, the black pin goes in and holds the sear. The rest are all silver and can go anywhere else. There's no particular order. The one above the sear end is not necessary. If you do need a pin in a pinch, you can steal that top one above the sear, the silver one. Then again, we're going to use the new springs from the spring kit to install the trigger spring, and then we'll need a pin for the pull spring on the sear, and then we'll hook the spring between the sear and the pin. After that, we will install the safety button, sliding it in, and then the trigger guard. Now we'll reinstall the front sight clip, install the clip spring, the pointy side on the top and sticking out or up, and then hook the latch on, and then I unlatch it until I'm ready to assemble so that the spring doesn't accidentally fly off. Reinsert the nuts that hold the ASA bolts and the ASA on, and then I install the new ball latch that is not broken or dry rotted, and then I go over the hole marker and make sure I got all the components, no extra parts laying off on the side, and then we are ready to install the other side of the clamshell. Now we can reinstall the other side of the clamshell. Make sure we add some lube and then evenly spread it out. I use my finger, and then you have to make sure the front clip spring in sight are clipped down, and then line everything up and then push it together, and then make sure there's no cracks or seams that are bigger, and then you can start reinstalling all the body bolts. I like to start with the center one first. That way it doesn't allow anything else to pop out of place while I work on the other screws. All the 5 screws are the same, and then there's the 6th screw that is for the front grip that is longer than the rest. Otherwise they're all the same. I'm wiping the heads of these screws, and I'm using some residual oil on my fingers to add a little lubricant to them. They have a little bit of surface rust, and this will help with that. I want to make sure that the body bolts are snug. You don't have to over torque them. Don't want to risk stripping the heads out. Make it harder for disassembly on the next time. The top screw that holds the sight clip on the front, you want to make sure that's tight but not too tight. If you make it too tight, the sight clip button won't go down. So if you tighten it to the point where it doesn't move anymore, you need to loosen it just a little bit so that it moves freely. Then we wipe down the feed neck. It has the 2 pins, and they can slide out if you need to remove them or replace them at any time. And then the clip that holds the feed neck in place with the front sight, and then the bolt that tightens down on the hopper. That just slides forward. You may need to work it in place, and then it clicks up. Lastly, we have the barrel. Just wipe the barrel down, screw it in. Next step would be to cock it back and pull the trigger to make it cycle a couple times. Make sure everything's working good. This Tippmann 98 Custom X rental is now ready to hit the fields again. Thanks everybody for your support, and thanks as always for watching. Till next time.